Saran Tovim, good afternoon, everybody here, and Erev Tov, good afternoon or good evening to everybody who is in Israel with us today. Great to see everyone here in our Rosh Chapel, and obviously Baby Drosh, and welcome to all those who are joined on our Zoom today. So we are very, very happy to welcome Noam Tzion and Rabbi Mishael Tzion with us here today to do some learning about Pesach, and in particular about the really incredible Haggadah supplement that they put together this year, and that we helped adapt for our own community. So let me just say a few words of introduction, and then we'll back, and forgive me with someone. I got my back to somebody when I'm talking here, so forgive me for that as I toggle back and forth. So as you all know, everyone from the TBS community knows, we've a number of years ago, we published our Haggadat Shalom, thanks to a wonderful gift from the Baskis family, in memory of Arnie and Susie's granddaughter, Maddie, which we're in our, Alex, our fourth or fifth printing of right now, if not even more, fourth printing of Haggadat Shalom. That's been a wonderful resource for our community. And each year, we look to refresh it and to keep it contemporary. So we have a version for children and families, and have put together a supplement each year. This year, of course, as we were getting closer to Passover, though not too close, we're already thinking about how Passover, like so many things in our world, is going to be different this year, post October 7th. And before we had a chance to have that conversation, Rabbi Lindemann, who's on here, forwarded me an email that he got from his bunkmate from Camp Ramon, the Poconos, I think, a few years ago, Noam Tzion, who is an incredible educator in Israel, and who actually has been here before. A number of years ago, he was here teaching, I think, from the different night Haggadah at that point too, sharing with us that he, along with his son, Rabbi Mishael Tzion, who is on with us too today, had been working on an update to the Halailah Hazeh Night to Remember Haggadah, which I have right here. We all know this is a favorite go-to that we have here at TBS and that we'd like to use. And Noam pointed out that it's been the 20-year anniversary for this Haggadah, and that Rabbi Tzion Mishael was working on a revision for it, and particularly, of course, thinking about the themes of the Haggadah for Israeli families post October 7th. And they're asking for our support in helping them print Haggadot for families who are displaced in Israel right now, to help celebrate the Passover holiday, and also just contextualize and think about it. So as I mentioned to all of you, we're grateful to be able to help make a donation from our Mishael Chai Fund, and thank all of you for supporting that, to purchase 500 Haggadot for displaced families in Israel. And as we did that, we had an ask of Noam and Mishael, which was if we could take their work and adapt it here to create our own Haggadat Shalom supplement that had aspects of what they put together, articles and pieces, and also some of the commentary from our own community. And they graciously said yes, with the only condition being that we share it with them once we finish it, which we have, and we're so grateful for that, and we invited them to come here and teach. What I have here, for those in the room this is actually not the final version of the Haggadah supplement. That is still at the printer, but it is being mailed until the next couple of days, and we'll have it here. This is just something printed in-house to use for today. If you're on the live stream, you're on the Zoom and you don't have a copy of this, that's okay. We'll be doing some screen sharing back and forth, and looking at what Rabbi Tzion and the Rabbi Tzion have to look at here today too. As we talk about, think about how we prepare for our Seders this year in a very different environment. There's so many parts of the Haggadah that resonate with us so differently today than they did even last year, or even for the last many years. And I'll just finally point out, this is the first in our series of 3. Next week, Rabbi Wexler will be teaching a lunch and learn, and the following week, I'll be back again teaching a lunch and learn too, so I'll prepare together for the Seder, using the supplement as our core text. And again, you'll have it by next week, God willing. So I want to thank Noam Tzion and Mishael Tzion for being with us today, and for the learning and teaching, and turn it over to them.
Okay. So let me start by saying how much I appreciate your synagogue's generosity. You were two of the 2 congregations that made the biggest contributions to this donation project. And let me explain to you what the big idea behind it was. one of the things that Mishael realized in already 3 or 4 months ago was that Simchat Torah, which was hardly a time of joy of Torah, because that was the 7th of October, that was the last major Jewish holiday. Hanukkah is just a home holiday. And that Pesach would be the next major holiday, and that it would be radically transformed for Jews in Israel for 2 reasons. First of all, many Jews would not have a house. How can you have a Seder when you don't have a home to be welcomed in? How can you have a Seder when you don't have a Haggadah? Because for 200,000 people, they were evacuated from their homes. Some of them from the kibbutzim that were destroyed, some of them because of the fear that Hezbollah can easily cross the border from Lebanon and again have a massacre, even before the army could get there to stop the massacre, because the massacre is not about war, it's about killing civilians, as you know. And that's almost impossible to stop, as we know about terrorism in general. So they pulled out 150,000 people from their homes for the last 6 months with no date at which they can go back. So therefore, the idea was, what can we give them to cheer them up a little bit at their Passover? A Passover in which they're going to think about what they don't have. And for the families who are mourning for the death of a soldier, for the death of a son or a daughter who was dancing in the Nova festival, my wife and Mishael's mother is a trauma therapist. She runs a specific group for parents of the Nova people, of the dancers. These are parents who didn't know each other in any way and now have come to know each other very deeply. And it's a support group of them to think 6 months down the line, where am I now emotionally? Almost all of Israel has gone through trauma, but these people have it the worst. And so one of the things Marcella gave to those people at their last session was a copy of the Haggadah that you donated, so they'll have some sense of a moment that somebody cares about them. In this case, somebody from far away physically, but not necessarily far away emotionally, cares about them. Something that's dedicated to the fallen civilians and military people, as the Haggadah is, and something, as you will see, that mentions and acknowledges this is not a normal Pesach. So I just want to thank you so much for that. And of course, to Steve Lindemann, who, when we were in camp together, I never thought he would become a rabbi. And now he's retired. Do they still call you Rabbi, Stephen? That's what I want to know. Or are you completely liberated and you can be Steve again? That's what I'd like to know. Anyway, it's because of that connection going back when we were 16, which was 60 years ago, that we made the connection through your Rabbi Micah and through your congregation to build this bridge. The idea is that when you open up your TBS Haggadah with the quotations from the new Israeli Haggadah that we are distributing to 6,000 families, then in some sense, you and the Israelis who are suffering most are going to be on the same page. And it's only solidarity, it's only acts of kindness which really have the power to pick us up spiritually and emotionally. And I turn to the rabbis for that support, because if anybody knows how a liturgy, how a text, how a book can be a source of spiritual uplift, it's rabbis who are constantly involved in the work of comforting people. So thank you very much for that donation. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mishael, whose idea it was to produce this new 2024 Haggadah, to tell you a little bit about how he came to that decision as my son.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Rabbi Micah, and everyone who's here. It's a real pleasure to speak to you. And I also want to say this is one of our first sessions teaching about the new Haggadah and teaching in English. So there's something very exciting about that. We're a little bit less than 3 weeks out before Passover. And so it's wonderful for us to also share these materials and hear your relationships to it. I want to jump straight in by using the Haggadah. What we thought today is we would actually track through a few different sections of the Haggadah and start from, I think it's your page 9. I'm talking about brokenness and yachat. And maybe, Rabbi Micah, if you can, either you could read or ask someone in the room to read. This is, after all, we're preparing for Seder, so it isn't Seder if there's a round robin of readers. And there's a selection there about brokenness that I wrote, and I would love if someone could read that out.
Sure. Is there a volunteer in the room to read, Mishael, you're entering the broken world article, that piece? Volunteer, like to read it? Charlotte, go ahead.
That's not story. Begins in a broken world.
Could I ask you just to come closer to the camera and microphone so we could hear the reader for everyone's?
The Pesach story begins in a broken world. Amidst slavery and oppression, the sound of the breaking of the matzah sends us into that fractured existence, only to become whole again when we find the broken half, the afikomen, at the end of the Seder. This brokenness is not just a physical or political situation. It reminds us of all those hard, damaged places within ourselves, all those narrow places from which we want to break free. In Hebrew, Egypt is called Mitzrayim, reminding us of the word tsar, narrow. Thus, in Hasidic thought, Mitzrayim symbolizes the inner straits that trap our souls. Yet even here, we can find a unique value. As the Hasidic saying teaches us, there is nothing more whole than a broken heart.
So I always found great symbolism in the fact that Seder night starts with the moment of Yachatz, which often is overlooked as just a strange ceremony to break a matzah and move on. And I think that the way in which we break the matzah, what I suggest here is also a symbolic entrance into the world of a broken heart. And I think when I wrote that piece 20 years ago, I felt like we need to work harder, perhaps, to enter a world of a broken heart on Passover. And this year, it's not hard to enter a world of a broken heart. So many places in which we look, and our heart breaks in so many ways, whether it regards to Israel, to suffering of people here in the Middle East, whether it regards to the way in which the directions in which the world is going, or the health of the world itself as a planet. Not to depress us too much, but there are plenty of reasons to hold that broken heart. And yet when we hold that matzah in our hand and we break it, we also know that we have the tools to mend it. We're going to hide the afikoman, but we'll come back and collect it. For me, as I started working on this project, I thought back on the first Seder that I led. It was in 2002, and I was working with my father on creating the first version of our Israeli Haggadah, translation and adaptation of a different night, the first Haggadah that he had put out in 1997. And my father, being the great educator that he is, said, okay, if you're preparing a Haggadah, you might as well lead the Seder. And so there I found myself at an age where you're not supposed to lead a Seder for everyone who's older than you, but that's the task that he gave me. And it was a very smart move. And we prepared a wonderful Seder with our big plan was to do all the different customs that all the different exiles of Jews have done over the years. We were going to sit on the floor like the Yemenites and hit each other with green onions like the Persians, and put the Seder table around everyone's head like the Moroccans, and sing "Let My People Go" like the North Americans. And we had a whole plan, and it was a beautiful Seder. One of my strongest memories from that Seder was my grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Sachs, talking about his first Seder in the land of Israel. In 1948, he had served as a chaplain in World War II in the U.S. Army, and he and my grandmother, Fran, took a boat to Israel in 1947. They joined the Haganah, and he was asked to lead the Seder for soldiers in the faraway, distant neighborhood of Talpiot, and that's what he did. And a few weeks later, the State of Israel was founded. And there was something just very moving hearing about that story, thinking also that my parents chose to live in the neighborhood of Talpiot, and I was born in that neighborhood. And surprisingly to me, I still live in that neighborhood. I've returned to that neighborhood and I love it. And it was a beautiful Seder night. And as we got to the food, my uncle Bensi comes up to me and he says, "Hey, Mish, I just listened to the radio out on the balcony and I heard the news report and there was a terrorist attack in Netanya. Should we tell everyone? What do we do?" And the drama of that question, I was thrown back to the drama of that question on October 7th, where we were all sitting at home. It was already Shabbat, Simchat Torah for us. Do we tell everyone what's going on? Do we not tell? Do we break the festivity and mourn, or do we hold some sort of semblance of holiday? And as I think about that tension, it also makes me think about how in the Haggadah itself, there are two moments where the Haggadah tells us that in every generation we must realize something. We realize that in every generation there are enemies who want to destroy us. And in every generation, we must see ourselves as if we ourselves left Egypt. So what is it? Are we stuck in perennial a war with those who want to kill us? Or is there a way out of Egypt? Is there a promised land? Is there a better tomorrow? And the fact that the Haggadah holds both those realities. For me, I often wanted to live in a world where I could say, okay, the enemies who want to get us, that's in the past. That was when we were in exile. That was before Israel. It was before America. Let's tell a new story. We've left that Egypt. And in many ways, October 7th, I think, was the last blow in the sense that for many Israelis, we realize, no, this is B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lechalotenu. We are going to find ourselves again and again in a situation of war. But that's not the only story I want to tell, and it's not the only story the Haggadah tells us to tell. We also tell the story of the fact that there's a way out of Egypt. Yes, in every generation there will be pharaohs, but in every generation we can also leave Egypt. We can go to the promised land. We can break out from this cycle of violence and tragedy. And I think for Israelis today, and you can tell me if you feel the same way in North America, to believe that there is a tomorrow is very important, that tomorrow can be different from yesterday, that tomorrow can be better than today. And that's the belief that the Haggadah wants to give us. When we bring back the afikoman from our broken matzah, we will also say, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habnuya, next year in a rebuilt Jerusalem. And that faith, that belief, that hope is part of what we try to create. So that's part of what we try to create in this supplement. An opportunity to reflect on October 7th and so much more than that. A place to recognize that, yes, there are enemies who are out to get us, but at the same time, we continue to believe in a tomorrow. We continue to believe in a L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. We continue to believe that the matzah can be made whole again. So with that, I think I'll pass it back to my dad for the next piece.
You're muted.
Mishael, can you share with the whole group so they can see the Omdim Aleinu?
Yes, great. Let me do that quickly. So actually, since I mentioned it, I'll also show you one important piece from the Haggadah. Just a second. Let me share my screen. So in the Israeli Haggadah that we created 20 years ago, we had a whole big question about how do we relate to the page of B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lechalotenu. In every year, in every age, in every generation, they seek out to destroy us. And what we thought we would do is we would actually create a table for a list of dates with as many tragic moments as we could fit on one page, and there were plenty to choose from. And when we made this long list of dates that really reflected that in every generation, in every country, in every place, Jews had faced that kind of adversity. Our illustrator, Mishael Kishka, who's a famous Israeli political cartoonist, said, you know, I'm going to add to that an illustration. And this is the illustration he made. I hope you can see that on the screen.
It appears in your Haggadot on page 15.
Oh, thank you. So you can find that on your Haggadah on page 15. And there's something, we were just speaking about this with Mishael, our illustrator, yesterday. There's something both kind of disturbing about seeing all these bad guys in the middle of your Haggadah, but also something kind of joyful, reminding that, they were out to get us, but the truth is it's them that don't exist anymore, and we are the ones who are still telling our story. Whether it's Ferdinand and Isabella, or the Pope, or the Crusaders, or the Nazis, or the Cossacks, that we made it through. Now, part of what's interesting is when Mishael sort of said, this is part of the Jewish tradition of black humor, kind of a dark humor that too often is lost and is so important to bring back to the Seder table. When he created the original illustration, he sent us a sketch of what he planned. And in the sketch, he drew one more figure. He drew a young woman looking at this group, a young woman maybe from Tel Aviv or Netanya, and she has her sunglasses and her little pouch, and she's looking at these enemies running after her, and she's sort of saying, what do I have to do with this? And I sort of see this as a younger generation looking at the history of anti-Semitism and saying, I'm not a part of this story. The story of anti-Semitism is over. There can't be any reason why you would want to be against me. I'm just a normal Western person like anyone else. And there was something very powerful about placing her in that illustration. But when we thought about it more, we said, it's better to have the illustration without her, because when she doesn't appear, when she appears, they're running after her. But if she doesn't appear, they're running after you. When we sat down a few months ago to think what new elements are we inserting in the Haggadah, Michel Kishka, the illustrator, said, this last Cossack over here, I'm going to replace him with a new figure, with a new character. And he drew this. This is a Hamas militant, Nukhba fighter, trained in Iran with a made in Iran rocket, out to try and catch us. And when he drew this, it was actually during the intense days where we were seeing these images again and again on TV. Kishka, with his sense of humor, drew a little banana peel, hoping to trip up the terrorist. And it sits on the Haggadah in this way. So you can see here, even without reading the Hebrew, you can see all the dates of all kinds of moments of anti-Semitism. You see everyone running here, and behind them, the Hamas fighter is kind of saying, wait for me, I'm coming, I'm joining this prestigious group of anti-Semites over the generation. I'll say that we've also gotten some pushback for this illustration. We hope it doesn't trigger people too much to see this. We'll find out. But it was important for us to also reflect the important piece that says history is being written now. And since history is being written now, Haggadot are being written now. Wherever Jewish history is written, Jews rewrite their Haggadot. And so that was part of our task as well, to rewrite the Haggadah through inserting this illustration. And over to you. Papi, you're on mute.
Mish, can you share the Temple Beth Shalom Haggadah so they will see the Manishtana, which is on page 11?
Yeah, I'll get that going.
Okay. So let me just add a little bit of historical background for Manishtana. Manishtana is simply, how is this night different, or why is this night different? And it's part of the great educational vision of the rabbis that say, you can't teach somebody anything until you've captured their attention, till they're interested. If you can get them to ask a question, then you can get them to listen to the answer. And the best questions are the questions that emerge when something is out of kilter, when you're disoriented, not when you're totally confused. If you're totally confused, you don't know what's going on. Some of the time after the massacre, I simply felt I had no sense of orientation whatsoever. But as I begin to put things in order, then I see, but this is a contradiction. This doesn't make sense. So the rabbis commanded that every year you have to come up with something at your Seder which is out of order. The word Seder means order. The way you get people to ask questions about the order is by intentionally creating disorder. one of the examples the rabbis used to do is to pass out dessert foods at the beginning of your Seder before Manishtana. For them, the great treats were to pass out nuts and popcorn. Yes, they didn't have corn, but they had popped grains. So if you pass out, I would say, Cracker Jacks, if you can get kosher lepesach Cracker Jacks, to everybody at the table, then somebody's going to say, wait a minute, what's Cracker Jacks doing on the Seder plate? Or the children, why are we being giving dessert before we've even started our meal? So the key thing for the rabbis was create some variation in your pattern. If on Shabbat you have challah, then a child who sees there's no challah, instead of challah, there's matzah, they're going to say, why is there matzah here? And the child who never is allowed to dip with his fingers, and suddenly they're dipping. He says, how come you're letting me dip? I always like to dip, but you never let me. Or how come you let me recline in my chair and roll back and forth on my chair? You always yelled at me that it was dangerous. So by allowing these anarchic elements, we get people interested. This year, we don't really have to provoke people into asking questions. We are inundated with the most existential questions. So you'll see the very first piece that Mishael wrote, a Seder icebreaker, because at your Seder, you want people to talk. How is this year different? When extended families and distant friends gather for an annual Seder, it's usual to catch up and ask what's new. To deepen this exchange, some families ask each one at the table to report briefly to everyone or to share with those sitting next to them the most important ways in which they or their world has changed since last year's Seder. I imagine American Jews, many of them are asking, how is my status as an American Jew feel different this year? In what ways is it threatened? In what ways is it reinforced? Certainly, watching the demonstrations in Harvard, they certainly made me think as an American, because I have my American citizenship, that this is not the America, this is not the Harvard, this is not the Columbia that I went to. So, the first thing is to let people talk about that difference, not to answer it, not to answer the questions, just to let these existential issues emerge a little bit as we recognize our situation. Then, Mishael had an idea. He said, you know, many of us learn by heart how to sing Manishtana. It used to be in Yiddish. In other countries, it was in Judeo-Arabic. But the point is not to recite the existing questions. It's to ask real questions. And in fact, in the kibbutz movement, in the secular kibbutz movement, 80 years ago, 70 years ago, whenever they wrote their Haggadot, they always solicited from the teenagers new questions, questions about contemporary life. And so one of the things that Mishael did was to go to the new National Library in Israel, which was opened late because of October 7th, but was opened, and to ask the librarian to bring him all kinds of Haggadot of the kibbutz movement. The kibbutzim, of course, have been in the center of the news because the kibbutzim were the first line of communities to suffer from Hamas's massacre and from the rapes. And therefore, he went through the Haggadot and he discovered some amazing questions. So I think you will find them. Mish, if you could share with us some of the questions from the Haggadah.
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, they're not in the Temple Beth Shalom Haggadah, right?
Okay, and I didn't include them. Okay, my mistake.
It's okay. Just give me a second. I'll pick it up. Okay.
Okay, so I'll tell you what some of those questions are. One of the questions asked in 1930: why do people all over the world hate Jews? Now, the people asking this question are kibbutznikim. They're socialists. They were deeply optimistic about the notion of the Jews coming back to the land of Israel. But when they looked in the 1930s at the growth in anti-Semitism in Poland, in Germany, in the United States, very strongly in the 1930s, led by Charles Lindbergh and by Father Coughlin, they said, why is everybody hating the Jews? Which certainly is what I felt during the first couple of months after the massacre. They asked other questions like terrifying ones. This one here near the bottom. Why is there so much bloodshed in the world? How different is this dark and dismal night from every other night? They're talking about the Passover Seder, and they're calling it a dark and dismal night. How strange and how bizarre is this world in this year, in this generation? What is happening to us that human beings are turning into malevolent, predatory animals? Those questions we can't help but ask them when we see the results of what Hamas did and their attempt to deny that it ever happened, but the evidence is so clear. So one of the things we did in this Haggadah is to try to bring out those old questions and say, how do old questions, how do they come to have new meaning in new contexts? And here we have a picture from, I don't think we have the, yes, we should have the Avner Gorin, or actually, let's take a look at Kishka's picture of Be'eri. Our artist, Michel Kishka, is a teacher at the Bezalel Art School, besides doing his political cartoons for many, many years. And the artists and the teachers of the Bezalel Institute, in order to try to help raise money for the kibbutznikim who had lost their homes, many of them burned, and had lost so many parts of their family, to raise money, they asked everyone to take a theme of one of the kibbutzim and to create a painting of it. This was the painting that was done by Michel Kishka. And it was very important to him that it not be a picture of the destruction. It was a picture of what the kibbutz is, not what had happened to it because of the external forces, but what it was because of what was built here. And here are the beautiful red kalaniot. In fact, there's a notion in Israel that in the spring around this time, you go down to the south near Aza and you see fields and fields of red poppies. Of course, because they're red, they also have the significance of blood. And if you look at the picture, you'll see not a destruction of a house, but people in the background are building a house together, an old-fashioned way of building it, but everybody together. And that became the symbol of kibbutz Be'eri for him. And that's part of what our Haggadah is. It brings in the kibbutz. It brings us not to depress us, but to face the issues and then try to generate a notion of hope for us. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to look for a moment at the second most important part of the Haggadah besides the four questions, which is, of course, the four children. Or in the days before we were concerned with being gender equal, the four sons. And if you'll take a look at 13 in the TBS Haggadah, then you'll see a picture of the four sons that Michel Kishka did. And of course, with his sense of humor. That's actually one of the things we thought was the difference between many Israeli Seders and the American Seders I remember is the sense of humor, in fact, sarcastic, cynical humor at an Israeli Seder is on a much higher level than it is at an American Seder. And our artist, as a political cartoonist, wanted to bring in that element of humor as well. So if we can find the TBS Haggadah, page 13, thank you. And you'll see in the corner is what Michel Kishka did 20 years ago. He wanted to say, who is the wise child of our generation? And instead of answering the way traditional Haggadot have done and say the wise child is the Talmud student, he's the yeshiva student, he's the one with payout, instead he said, in our generation, who is the hero? Whose wisdom is one that everybody wants to imitate in secular Israel? Of course, the startup Israeli of 20 years ago. Here he is sitting on a pile of 7 books. Every book is titled with a different word for why, ketzad, lama, madua, all of it, why? It's the curiosity of the nerd, of the techie. That's the curiosity that leads him to be so inventive with the computer. And as he sits there looking not very attractive from a masculine point of view, with his curly hair and his matzah, he has a computer on his lap. And in really small print, it says Intel, as in the great company of technological advances, Intel. And the second word is legent, intelligent. I'm the intelligent one. And in Israeli startup world, it was considered if you're not necessarily a soldier, not necessarily a pilot, certainly not a Talmud scholar, if you're a geek like that, you have the possibility to sell your company for $4 million or much more to an American company, and that's the wisdom. So he makes fun of these various items. Now, of course, the principle of having 4 children is to teach parents what parents ought to know, but never get taught. And that is that every child you have is different, right? Such a simple truth. Of course, the funny thing about being a parent is that you don't have to get a license to become a parent. At least for driving lessons, you have to study something. To be a doctor, you study something. To do many things, you have to study and get certified. But to be a parent, nothing's required. The Haggadah is the teacher's guide. It's the Parenting for Dummies book. And the 4 children are teaching you every child, and every child in a different mood is a different personality. And every child in a different age is a different person. Your job is to enter into communication, to tell stories, to talk about Jewish identity and human values to each child, beginning where they are at, not where you're at, where they're at. So if we need to have different kinds of sons, don't we need different kind of daughters? And this is what Mishael Kishka created for our new Haggadah. Okay, good. So let's start with the one on the right. Here we have an Israeli soldier. There are not many countries in the world in which there is a draft for women into the army, as there is in the Israeli army. There are certainly volunteers in many armies who are women. And for the first time, just in the last 2 years, we had so many women who volunteered and chose to be combat soldiers that there were complete units of combat soldier women who fought on October 7th and killed many, many terrorists and liberated some of the kibbutzim that had been conquered by Hamas. And so it's quite natural that this new image is placed. Traditionally, in all the traditional Haggadot, the wicked child is almost always shown as being a soldier, because for 1,000 years, the greatest enemy of the Jewish people was the soldier, was the Cossack, was the military. The Jews didn't go into the army. Their ideal was the Talmudist, the scholar. That's exactly the crisis in Israel right now, as the ultra-Orthodox say, we don't want our children to go to the army. We want them to be scholars. And the general Israeli society says, what are you talking about? The only way to save lives, whether you're ultra-Orthodox or whether you're secular, is if our children are willing to go and fight for us, and our daughters have to fight for us as well. And so it was appropriate for us to put in a combat soldier. We wanted to show this is not about militarism. And so we showed you a typical Israeli officer in combat, continues to be, even after they finish the regular army, they're in miluim, they're in reserve duty. And this woman is in reserve duty. She's already a mother, she already has a child, and she still has her gun. And more in Israel, we see people walking around in the streets with their guns because they never know when they're going to be attacked by a terrorist. It's a very much a palpable feeling. So to have a gun, to have women who have a gun, is now, if a woman's job is traditionally to protect her home, now she can really protect her home. That's one image of Israeli society. Notice in these 4 images, we did not say this is the wicked woman, this is the wise woman, this is the simple woman. Now, all the women you're going to see here are all wise women, activist women, typical of Israeli society. So if you'll go now to the left and pick up the one with the protester, here is a protester. You know that Israeli society has been torn apart since the beginning of 2023, that there were 9 months of massive demonstrations against the attempt of Netanyahu and the ultra and the radical Zionist religious parties to change the rules in Israel having to do with the legal system to make it more like Hungary, in which the courts could no longer veto unconstitutional laws, in which they didn't have any power of checks and balances over the parliament or over the prime minister. And therefore the liberals and the centrists came out and say, this is a violation of what what Israel is really all about. And here's a young woman, a person actually that we know quite well, very short, very activist, very upbeat, and she led those demonstrations for 9 months. Then she went into the Israeli army for 4 months. Now she's back, and she was part of a demonstration on Sunday with 100,000 Israelis coming up to Jerusalem to protest in front of the Knesset. And she's demanding, we want to be free now. There is no freedom without a powerful judiciary and the independence of these different ranges. So that's our second woman of Israeli society. If we move down, we're going to see another option. Here you can see the radical diversity in the Israeli society. This is not an ultra-Orthodox woman. Ultra-Orthodox women would be dressed in black. They would not be concerned. They would be non-Zionists. They clearly wouldn't be interested in supporting the army. They don't see the country and the state of Israel as being an important value. It's just where they happen to live. But this woman takes Israeli society and the state very seriously. She's probably a religious Zionist settler. But even though she's a settler, that doesn't make her anti-modern. You can see how she gets around on her scooter, how she has a special backpack for her child, not at all traditional. And what she's reading, which is a new phenomenon in Israel the last 10 years, she is studying Talmud just like a man would study Talmud. So she's both rebellious in a certain kind of way, and at the same time, she has a radically different perspective than does the protester we saw above. And the last one, over to the right side, is another kind of Israeli, because Israeli society is not made up only of Jews. It's also made up of many people who have joined the Jewish people without converting. This woman, Lona, is very popular in Israel. She is a marathon runner. She represents Israel in the marathon races in the Olympics. In fact, several years ago when she ran, she was the 6th fastest woman on a marathon in history. Her name is Lona. She came from Kenya. She was an au pair taking care of the Kenyan ambassador's children. She went out running. She met a great Israeli track coach, and she married him. And now she's an Israeli, and her flag is another part of what Israeli society is about. That diversity is really important. Probably the greatest sin of the political critics of Israel today is to think that everybody is Netanyahu, to essentialize all Jews as being the same. And we want to emphasize the diversity of those people. Mishael, can I ask you to deal with some of the elements having to do with hope in our Haggadah? This is a Haggadah that recognizes terrible things that happened this year, but it's not a Haggadah about memorials, about tears. It's a Haggadah about hope.
Great. So we wanted to, as we said before, we wanted to end this this discussion with the place of hope, and the Haggadah itself ends with the place of hope. And sometimes in order to go for hope, you need to go into the darkest place. And so what we wanted to share is 2 texts that come from families of hostages themselves. The first one comes from Jackie Levy, and you can find it on page
20.
On page 20 of the supplement. Jackie Levy is a famous Israeli storyteller and performer. His niece and nephew lived near Gaza and were abducted, were taken hostage, together with their father, Ofer Calderon, and the names of the 2 children are Sar and Erez. And thankfully, the 2 children were released in the releases of hostages earlier in the year. And when that happened, J.K. Levy wrote the following piece, which we put, when I saw it, I asked him to include it in the Haggadah, because I felt like here is a really beautiful description of what redeeming means. On Passover night, we thank God for redeeming us. But how often have we actually thought what it means to be redeemed? And here, Jackie, through the despair and the challenge of this war, gives us a window into what it means to be redeemed. The kids have returned, that is all one can mumble. While our family is usually very verbal, during this long period of the children in captivity, everything had shrunk to a few isolated words of hope. They will come back. For 2 months, our deficiency in words has thrown us into the arms of both old songs and biblical verses, the Israeli musical feed, and the childhood heritage of our Judaism. When we have nothing to say, we try to rely on a good quote. Then every classic line, every verse, and every word reveals itself anew. Suddenly, they are charged with relevance as if they had been written just for this moment. Ever since we finally saw the faces of these children of kibbutz Nir Oz, and among them Sahar and Erez, the words coursing repeatedly in my heart are from the opening of the psalm recited on Passover. Praise God, for God is good and divine kindness is forever. That is what those redeemed by God from the hand of the enemy declare. How often have I recited those well-worn festive words in the past, but never once took the time to think how those redeemed are really meant to feel. What does a human being feel and say when granted his life anew, after having been held hostage in the hands of his enemy? After those one loves have spent days, weeks, or months in a place where their lives are not worth a cent, then suddenly the time for a hug arrives, the very opposite of the clutches of the enemy's hands. Then apparently one says, praise God, for God is good, and divine kindness is forever. Even though in this left-wing Zionist family of kibbutzniks, I am almost the only one who ever prays and feels at home among those ancient verses, something like, praise God is exactly what the children's mother, Hadass, said. She said these words after they announced to her that they had been liberated, and after she concluded roaring like a lioness who had just rescued her cubs from the teeth of the jackals. After Hadass stretched up her arms to the heavens, arms which I think have of late become elongated by 10 centimeters, then she said, yes, there is a God. That is just an updated version of saying, praise God, for God is good. Hodu LaHashem ki tov, ki le'olam chesdo. I hope you felt the power and the rawness of this text. And we turn specifically to the families of the hostages for hope. The second piece that you'll find in the supplement, and the place we wanted to end with is really the place of praying for next year in Jerusalem. And if you look on page 23 of the supplement, you'll see the closing illustration of Mishael Kishka, an illustration that he made for the original Haggadah. And he draws the Jerusalem of L'Shana Ba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya, of the rebuilt Jerusalem. And even though Jerusalem is built and prosperous in many ways, I think at its heart it feels that it is in a moment of destruction, and we're hoping for it to be rebuilt. And here Kishka drew the Messiah appearing on a donkey, pretty cool Messiah on his fun donkey. We have Jews and Arabs sharing coffee together or comparing children. We even have the rival football teams in Jerusalem of Beitar Jerusalem and Hapoel Jerusalem hanging out together. And perhaps the most fantastical of all, the cab driver is reading the newspaper, which says that Israel won the Soccer World Cup. So it's always good to dream big dreams. Dreaming big dreams there on the parapet is Theodor Herzl and a pigeon, the dove, the sign of peace that we hope for, and the name of the gate is Sha'ar HaShalom. We got some responses for people for this illustration saying, if you're drawing the Messianic times, why is the Dome of the Rock still there? Shouldn't all the mosques disappear of Jerusalem? And we said to them, no, the opposite. The vision of Jerusalem that we have is a Jerusalem where three religions can live in peace, not where one religion beats all the others in a sum-zero game. So it's been 50 minutes, and I don't want to hold you over, but if there's time for questions or comments, we try to take together with you, go through a journey from Manishtana, what is different this year, through the brokenness of the matzah, through the four children, and finally ending with how we move from the depth of despair to hope, and a prayer for a better year in the time to come.
Thank you so much, Mishael and Noam, for sharing all of that. I mean, it's such an incredible response and addition to the Haggadah. Feel so fortunate to be able to share it with our community, with our supplement too. And we do have some time for some questions. So let's open it up. If you're here, I'll come on the microphone. If you're online, please use the raise your hand function and reactions. And if you have any questions for either Mishael or Noam, we'll open it up. Session about Passover with no questions. Anybody? Same here, Bonnie. Nice and loud.
How do you handle your young ones at the table for the Seder? What do you say that make them feel more comfortable and okay, just sitting around being a family with everything that has going on?
Rabbi, I don't think that microphone is connecting.
Okay, I might not be. So I'll just repeat Bonnie's question, which is an excellent one, and one that I think I've heard from a few different people, which is, you know, what do you do with the young ones at your Seder, right? As we want to engage them and of course make it an engaging experience, everything else, but of course there's a heaviness over everything. There's important conversations to be had, but the children are there too. How are you thinking about balancing, you know, some of the pieces you've brought here and your own table too, I'm sure, with children at it?
Maybe I'll start. And the first thing is sometimes the table is the biggest problem. How long can you, if you're a young person, sit around a table, especially when you're not eating for at least an hour and a half at the beginning? And so in our family, what we often do is we'll start the Seder early before we actually do the ritual elements and drink the wine while sitting at the table. We will move to the living room, and there we will have the children do all kinds of plays in which they act out the stories of Egypt, each time in a different way, sometimes with paper bag dramatics, sometimes by asking one of the good storytellers in the family to bring out books about the Exodus or about the Prince of Egypt and to tell those stories, sometimes with hand puppets, whatever kind of tool you can find. That was the insight of the rabbis who put together the Haggadah, knowing we need physical symbols and things you manipulate. Then we would actually begin the Seder at reclining on pillows, very often on the floor, on couches. We would even have the first cup of wine in the as a kind of a cocktail, the way it originally was for the rabbis. And then the dips are served. Now, in a family in which people try to say, we're only going to have a little bit of celery or a little piece of potato, how long can that keep you going? So in our family, based on the most ancient Seders that are preserved in the ancient Egyptian Geniza from almost 1,000 years ago, we knew they had lots of hors d'oeuvres. They had rice, they had different kinds of meats. In our family, we have every food that can be dipped, meaning we sometimes have strawberries with chocolate dip, like kind of a fondue. We'll have potato chips with dips. We'll have ketchup and French fries. We'll have, in our family where we love artichokes with a kind of vinaigrette dip. The more dips, the better, so that the people at the Seder will ask the question, why are we having so many dips at the beginning of the Seder? That's a good question. Anytime you get a question at the Seder, it's a good question, unless the question is, when do we eat? So as long as we keep the children, and I mean the grown-up children, with enough to nosh on, their noshing goes with the droshing. That is, their conversation is accompanied by dipping and eating exactly the way the Greeks, who also reclined on pillows. Now, your chairs are pretty comfortable, but another thing to do, both for the children and the adults, is to have everybody bring a pillow. The people coming to your Seder, if they carry a pillow, and maybe even nicely decorate the pillow, maybe tie-dyed, whatever, or just a nice pillow, and bring it and everybody put it on their chair. Again, the more you bring, the more kids can do these fun things. Kids, for example, can be given Lego to build a Lego pyramid, and that pyramid could be placed in the middle of the table as a kind of a centerpiece. All those things happening before you get up, move to the table, and then you begin the heavy eating and soup and so on. In fact, sometimes we'll put either a trough of water or at least a blue scarf between the living room and the dining room, so everybody has to cross the Red Sea, or in this case, the Blue Sea, on their way towards the table. Those are some of the very easy things that we have used for many years in our family.
So let me just thank you, Noam, for those suggestions and all of that, which are terrific. But you know, what about when you're dealing with the topics of this year, right? That post October 7th, And that balance between, having those conversations, I think for many adults need to have, while also, understanding the Seder is very much for the kids, and you want to make sure they have an experience that's positive and memorable and everything else.
So it's a great question. I mean, I think that one suggestion that we've been thinking about is how, by recognizing that we have different audiences around the Seder, one of the best ways to do it is to plan one or two parts that are based on different audiences. So, for example, especially if you have young Seder, and I think this is true in general, the Seder this year should still also be joyful. We should also read the text we always read and eat the foods we always eat, because that joy is so important in giving us the resilience that we need in order to weather these times. And yet, in order to stay relevant and real to our hearts and our reality, I think it's good to choose 2 or 3 moments during the Seder in which we will react and discuss the more challenging reality that we're in. So, for example, spending some time during Manishtana, if there are teenagers there, I think would be very meaningful just to talk about, as we read before, what is different this year? How are we different this year? When we get to those who are out there to destroy us, that's a good opportunity to talk about it. At Shfoch Hamatcha, or really anywhere where you can grab the moment, grab it. However, and make sure that you're also thinking strategically when there's time when younger kids are there. So often at the beginning of the Seder, when we do Kiddush and Karpas, when we sing Manishtana and talk about Avadim Hayinu, that's when the younger children are still active and interested. At some point, they start wandering off, and that's a good moment to have one of the relatives or teenagers take all the younger kids to do a play, to play a game, to watch a movie, if that's your tradition. Figure out something that they can do for 20, 30 minutes of adult conversation. And that's your chance to have the more serious conversation that you have. So figuring out how to parse out the audience in the different ages with a little bit of educational strategy can go a long way to allow to have the Seder, the fun Seder with the kids, and the more challenging conversations that the teenagers and the adults want to have.
Thank you. Rob and Sue, and then Alvin, then I think we'll have to wrap up.
When you said you start with the kids earlier, do you do that thing the 75 minutes ahead of time? Or what time do you start?
It really depends on what time you want people to eat and what time people can get there. In Israel, traditional families do not start a Seder. They don't say the Kiddush until it's dark. And that can be 8 o'clock or even 8:30.
Right.
And therefore, we invite our kids, we invite them for 5:30, for 6, and then they do their activities. They move around a lot. We set up the children's room. So the more different spaces we have, we'll put a lot of time in that earlier slot. And then when you get to the sit-down part, which is more intellectual and more ritual-oriented, the first part aims at the children. They have to be part of the rituals as well. And then pretty quickly, the children go and leave the table, and we're left with the teenagers, the college students, the adults. And that's when we have to remember the Seder is not only for little children, it's also for big children and for real issues. And that's the art. That's what Mishael talked about in terms of the strategic planning of how much do I spend on this? How much do I spend on that? In fact, often we will ask somebody different to be the master of ceremonies for the different parts. So we'll have somebody who's really good with early childhood education for the earlier parts, or maybe 2 of them, or maybe some teenagers who are good with younger kids. And then we'll have the ritual people who knows how to sing Kiddush the best, and we'll give that responsibility. And then somebody who's going to lead a discussion about this year and what the relationship between a holiday of freedom is and what's been happening all over the world. In the Ukraine, for example, this is not only a problem of Israel, this is a worldwide problem, and that's a good conversation to have. In other words, we very often plan and will list 5 or 6 people. We're going to write down which part of the Seder they're responsible for. We're going to print it up. People will know the order of the program. And we also write down who brought the charoset and who brought the roast beef and who brought the dips, because those are equally important contributions. The more individuals involved in making the Seder, the more meaning they make for themselves. So if you happen to be the host and you think a host has to do everything and the guest simply has to say, oh, you did a wonderful job, that's a misunderstanding of how we make meaning when we each have something to contribute.
Yes, so my husband's been doing it for years and dividing it up. One idea that when you said the dips is at Karpas, we do the traditional blessing, but then we give them the salad and dips.
Yes.
Because we say it's green and here's green. It might have a tomato on it, might have a cucumber, whatever.
Lovely.
So thank you, Robin. So I know we're we are out of time. I want Alvin to get the last question here, and then we'll start to wrap up.
It seems to me that this Haggadah is very contemporary for what's going on this year, but let's hope that you're right, and next year it's a new world, a better world. Will this Haggadah still be as relevant? Your different night is clearly relevant every year, but this could become dated very quickly in many ways. How do you foresee that happening or not happening?
Yeah, did you hear that one okay?
Michelle, I think you should try that one if you like.
Why don't you give that one more time?
Will this become a corona
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
we throw out next year?
The question is basically about, this, Haggadah in our fast-changing world. In some ways, please God, may it only be relevant this year. Next year we can go back to the joys, the joy of Pesach, the different night Haggadah, Halailah Hazeh, blood of staying power. How do you see this?
Well, look, I mean, right. This is not a good time to prophesize about the future. But in the Haggadah that we created in Israel, we made sure that most of the pieces don't relate to October 7th specifically. They relate to all the themes that have been true throughout Jewish history and Israeli history. And within that, there are 5 or 6 places where we relate specifically to October 7th. But at the same time, that's the joy also of supplements where they can focus on something more zoomed in. I hope this Haggadah will remain relevant for a long time, and I also hope that the news will become more and more improved. But I hope that the painful memory of October 7th will not be something that is erased so quickly from our stories. But I think part of what we need to remember is that times of great adversity are not only times of loss, they are also times of growth. Egypt was terrible, but Egypt is where we tell our story. The destruction of the temple was terrible, but it created growth and change. That's harder to say about the Crusades or the Holocaust. But we do know that even after those times, there was a resurgence of growth. And that's what resilience is really about. It's not about being protected from, it's about knowing how to fall with the punches and to climb back up again and do it better the next time around. And that's what I think has kept us through these last 3,000 years, and hopefully will last us at least a few more until the artificial intelligence comes to get us.
Well, Toda Rabah, thank you so much, Rabbi Shmuel, to Noam, for work and for being with us today, and also for allowing us to adapt the wonderful work you've done, important work you've done for our community too. You should, God willing, in the next few days, we're receiving the mailbox, everyone will, our Haggadah supplement for this year. We'll have copies here at the shul as well. We'll be learning more about it next Tuesday or the Tuesday afterwards. As our lunch and learns, we'll be learning about it on Shabbat morning as well. So I want to wish you both an early Chag Pesach Sameach, and thanks for so much for joining us. And Laila Tov.
So
So thank you, everybody.